So my thanks to Paul and to Gail and to so many others who have made this, and to the Angelicum and so many who have made this wonderful and really unique conference possible. So my thanks to all of you. Also, as you all know, I represent the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. And 3 years ago, we had a conference on Nicaea, and I'm very proud and happy to say that the book has now been published. And you can see my colleague George Nimakopoulos, who will have a copy of the book. He doesn't have it on him right now, but throughout the rest of the conference, he'll have it. So if you want to take a look at it at the coffee hour, he'll have it on his person. It has a nice cover, so at least you want to see that. And the last thing I want to flag is that I do think that my paper actually has a nice continuity with Bishop Kyrillis's, especially on the concept of coherence. So here I go. So in 1977, in an article first written in Greek, then translated into French, and then published as the first paper of Being as Communion, John Zizioulas wrote that the Greek fathers of the 4th century introduced no less than a revolution in Greek philosophy, which he would later refer to as a new philosophy that involved, quote, a radical reorientation of classical Greek humanism, a conception of man and a view of existence which ancient thought proved unable to produce in spite of its many achievements in philosophy, end quote. This revolution had two poles to it. One, the uncreated created distinction, and two, the grounding of being itself in personhood. Both of these poles, which he calls leavenings of Greek philosophy, introduced for the first time, according to Zizioulas, freedom and relationality into the understanding of being, which would have profound existential consequences for understanding what it means to be human. One could call this Zizioulas's ontological revolution. And although Zizioulas relies heavily on the Cappadocians for this revolution, and specifically their identification of hypostasis with prosopon, I think we would all agree that whatever the Cappadocians were doing, this ontological revolution has something to do with Nicaea, and specifically the concept of the homoousios. So in a sense, if there is an ontological revolution, it is one that Nicaea initiated in Western thought. In other words, Nicaea was responsible for throwing into the pot of Western thinking a new idea having to do not simply with Jesus of Nazareth, the Jesus of the Scriptures, the Messiah, but with God's relation to the world, which is also about the relation of the uncreated to the created, infinity to finitude, transcendence and immanence, eternity and time, the one and the many, matter and spirit, to name a few ontological categories. But once Zizioulas made this claim, what followed was a slow trickling onslaught of criticism from John Panagopoulos, Savas Agouridis, Andre De Halu, Lucian Turcescu, and a few patristic scholars. The criticism centered on Zizioulas' interpretation of the fathers and their use of the categories of hypostasis and prosopon. Others took the opportunity for further amplifying what has gone wrong with theology since the patristic period, with a particular focus on a form of systematic theology. So Zizioulas was not simply wrong in the way that he interpreted the fathers, he was just simply wrong, he was just simply doing theology in the wrong way, and definitely not the way that the fathers did it. None of these criticisms had the generosity shown by Rowan Williams in his review of Being as Communion, where he says that this book, quote, illuminates, connects, and challenges. If it is at times overbold and schematic in the reading of the patristic tradition, this ultimately matters less than its powerful imaginative consistency, its ability to show that the kind of church we commit ourselves to tell us more than we might suppose about the kind of God we believe in and the kinds of spiritual universe we inhabit, end quote. So attempts were then made to recapture a patristic way of doing theology, most notably one that focused on a form of scriptural reasoning. These forms of theology were diametrically opposed to those that emerged because of modern questions, especially the modern critique of theological and religious ideas. The argument was put forward that theology does not have to respond to those questions that come outside the faith. Theology is its own discourse and language game. Theology need not respond to a particular audience, but should create its own audience. The church does not have a social ethic, but is a social ethic. So I mentioned the debate surrounding Zizioulas' claims about the Cappadocians, and thus by extension Nicaea, causing a revolution in thought, not because I wish to defend Zizioulas here today. I have both defended and critiqued him in other writings. My purpose here today is first to highlight the fact that Nicaea, in affirming the concept of homoousios, was also raising questions and perhaps making a statement about how to do theology. There's no question that leading to the declaration of the homoousios, the words like ontological or systematic theology were never used. There's also no question that a form of scriptural reasoning was dominant that is not always evident in modern and postmodern forms of Christian theology. Zizioulas' work is an example of that absence. But were the debates leading up to and surrounding the Council's affirmation of the homoousios really just about the Scriptures? A look at some of the passages by St. Athanasius of Alexandria would suggest otherwise. One of Athanasius' most perplexing arguments against those he labels as Arians in his orations against the Arians is the one where he attempts to argue for the divinity of the Son by stating that if the Son were not divine, the Father would not be eternally Father. Notwithstanding the fact that Pannenberg thinks it's Athanasius' most crucial insight, I never thought it a convincing argument for the Trinity. But it took me a while to realize that the force of the argument only makes sense if one takes into account the shared presuppositions between Athanasius and the so-called Arians. Among other things, both would agree that the Son is a mediator between God and creation. In order to preserve a particular notion of divine simplicity, the so-called Arians do not identify the Son as the true God, but as something distinct from creation, so as to affirm some kind of mediation between God and creation. Otherwise put, the so-called Arians want to affirm a particular notion of divine simplicity and some sort of communion. Athanasius, however, calls them on their incoherency. The attempts to preserve a certain kind of understanding of divine simplicity that doesn't allow for communion with the true God is forcing the so-called Arians to deny an identification of the Son with the true God, and the consequence of which is the conclusion that the Father is not eternally Father, which in the end destroys the very notion of divine simplicity the so-called Arians are trying to preserve. Essentially, he is saying the so-called Arians cannot have their cake and eat it too. In order to allow for a notion of divine simplicity that would allow for communion with the divine, they must allow for an understanding of divine simplicity in which the Father eternally generates the Son. By identifying the Son with the true God, Athanasius is not simply following any notion of divine simplicity, but one that allows for the principle and the logic of divine human communion. This affirmation of the principle and logic of divine human communion is clear in the orations, especially in Athanasius' discussion of Proverbs 8:22. The Lord created me as the beginning of his ways for his works, in the second oration. It functions as an interpretive key to the Scriptures. Athanasius spends many pages arguing why the Son cannot be considered a creature before actually offering an interpretation of the passage itself. As he says in paragraph 44, quote, "We have taken up these points at such length and have countered the irrational fabrications which they have devised in their hearts before dealing with the passage of the Proverbs, so that they may recognize that it is not fitting to call the Son of God a creature and may thus learn to read correctly the passage in the Proverbs according to its right sense," end quote. Prior to this, Athanasius argues that, quote, if the nature of originated beings needs a mediator because it is not capable of partaking in the direct activity of God, then it is altogether necessary that the Word, as a creature whose being is also originated, also needs a mediator for his creation. For he too is one of those whose nature is originated and cannot partake of God's activity, but has need of a mediator. And if a mediator is found for him, then there will be again a need for another mediator, end quote. Life with the uncreated God is not possible on the basis of created reality's own power. He states, quote, "For the nature of originated things was not trustworthy for this, since angels transgressed and men misunderstood. On account of this, God was a necessity, that he himself might free those who had come under a curse," end quote. Gregory of Nazianzus would amplify this point in declaring that that which is not assumed is not healed, meaning not simply that Christ assumed full humanity, but that the full humanity must be assumed by full divinity in order to be healed. So the buck must stop somewhere. Either give up the idea that mediation is possible or admit that mediation is in and through the Son as the true God. Notwithstanding this important hermeneutical key is why the so-called Arians misunderstood Proverbs 8:22. It would indeed not be difficult to find similar passages in Basil and Gregory the Theologian, or for that matter in Dionysius and Maximus the Confessor. The principle in the logic of divine human communion is also evident in On the Incarnation, where the audience is seemingly not Christian, and which would mean that Athanasius is responding to questions coming from outside the faith. It must also be assumed that he takes into account shared presuppositions with the Gentiles, since there can be no argument without shared presuppositions. What's absolutely fascinating to me is how often Athanasius uses the language of fitting or appropriate or reasonable for an understanding of God that involves God's union with creation. Not only is it fitting, according to Athanasius, but he says quite strongly that, quote, it was not right that God should permit human beings to be destroyed by corruption, because this was neither proper, aprepes, nor fitting, anaxion, for the goodness of God, tis tou theou agathotitos. Whatever one's conception of simplicity and goodness of God, it must allow for a union with creation so as to save creation from death and corruption. If Anselm would later say that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought, Nicaea and Athanasius are saying that that greater which actually can be thought is a God who is free to be in communion with the not God. So since the time of Nicaea and Athanasius, much has changed, most especially the questions and the shared presuppositions for argument and discourse. A mechanistic view of the universe that itself was taken as a new given, a new undisputed presupposition, not simply for theology, but for all discourses, made it almost impossible to think theology in terms of the principle and the logic of divine human communion. How can communion with God be possible when the universe is a perfectly fine-tuned machine? So given the givenness of Newtonian science and Descartesian clear and distinct ideas, the only God revelation that seemed to make sense was a dualist model. Faced with this challenge, I would agree that Christian theology around this time went on the defensive, and in so doing lost the courage of its conviction. It especially lost the courage of affirming the principle and the logic of divine human communion, which flows from the primary name of Christians for God, which is love, both in terms of eros and agape. In physics today, it seems acceptable for mutually contradicting theories to coexist until some resolution reveals itself. In the 17th century, rather than affirm the truth of divine human communion over and against the Newtonian dualist model, Christian theology surrendered itself to a non-incarnational, a non-Nicene mode of thinking. Really bad forms of Christian theology emerged, such as the deist conception of God, which, as Charles Taylor would argue, had become the default in increasingly de-Christianized society. The presuppositions, however, would continue to change, which included a non-mechanistic view of the universe, and more importantly, the Hegelian notion that reason itself has a history. If reason has a history, that means that the very presuppositions on which reason itself reasons change over time. But also those presuppositions may change depending on the space in which we are positioned. Time and space do affect reasoning, but not in the way that Kant himself perhaps had conceived. This change in presuppositions has led to a theological fragmentation, where it seems as if anything goes and where personal experience seems to be the one and only criterion for doing theology. One response to this fragmentation was to reaffirm a particular form of Christian thinking, one that was lost in the modern shuffling of thought. A philosophical turn to language encouraged enclave-like thinking that was justified in terms of language games and mutually exclusive discourses. The Christian response to the lingering effects of the Newtonian cosmic dualism was what I would call an epistemological dualism. And arriving full circle, it's this epistemological dualism that is on full display in the criticism of Zizioulas and in the recovery of a more authentic form of doing theology found in the patristic writings. Instead of the modern everything before the 17th century, we have a postmodern attitude that everything after the 17th century took a wrong turn, is a theological mistake, and must be ignored. So the singular epistemological insight of Nicaea, however, is not a returning to scriptural reasoning, but one that prohibits dualism of any kind, including epistemological dualisms. This claim can be further amplified with reference to Justin Martyr's Logos Spermatikos or Maximus the Confessor's notion of the Logi. If the homoousios affirms the possibility of a real indwelling of the uncreated and the created, God and the not God, infinity and the finite, then one should look for Christ everywhere, even in supposedly non-Christian discourses such as Feuerbachian projection, Freudian psychoanalysis, and critical theory. In theology, it means that epistemological dualisms of any kind should be dismantled, including those between scriptural reasoning and systematic theology, or the so-called traditional forms of theology and liberative forms of theology. Theology needs to realize that the content of the truth of the Christ event must be manifested in many forms, including non-theological forms, such as the arts and especially poetry. The revelation of Christ is like the phenomenological cube. Never can it be seen in its fullness. It must be turned and seen from many sides in order to know the essence of the cube. The homoousios affirms for us that God in all God's fullness is incarnate in Jesus Christ, and yet the fullness of this revelation has many sides. It is our human experience, expressed in many different forms, that allows us to glimpse those sides. As one very, very obvious example, it took a long time for humans to realize that the experience of slavery is simply incoherent, incompatible with the faith in the incarnate Christ, and that because of the witness of the experience of the slaves themselves. So it seems like I'm arguing for a kind of theological pluralism on the basis of Nicaea, but one that would seem to contradict the kind of dogmatism promoted by Nicaea itself. Yes, I am arguing that the Nicene homoousios, insofar as it affirms the full divinity of Christ, is also making a claim about dualisms and thus about epistemological dualisms. Put more positively, it opens up theology to be done in many forms, including the much maligned of late systematic theology. It also would demand of theology a hermeneutical generosity that would force the theologian to pay attention to any and all forms of theology in order to be fully immersed in the revelation that is Christ, that is the Christ event. But the homoousios does not mean that anything goes. It does not lead to relativism. How can it? It is affirming the truth of divine human communion. And in the end, this is the criterion that would hold together a theological pluralism. It would be the common presupposition of the homoousios, that materiality itself was made for communion with God, is not in competition with divinity, was created to bear the weight of the divine. What the dogma of the homoousios calls for is, ironically, a theodic theological pluralism. I want to end by drawing on Karl Barth, who famously wrote about the three forms of the Word of God: the Word, the Scripture, and the proclamation. He also argued that theology's job was to correct proclamation to be preached in accordance with the Scripture. For Barth, it was through these three forms of the Word that one comes to faith, and proclamation was restricted to preaching. But I disagree with Barth on this point. Proclamation can take on many forms, and one of those forms, I think, is theology, even if it is dogmatic or systematic theology. But the truth of Christ, perhaps one of its many sides, can only be expressed in other forms, such as poetry, painting, dance, and even ironically in non- or even anti-Christian discourses. So the homoousios does not shut down discussion. It is not a conversation stopper, but a conversation starter, so long as that conversation has as its main theme the realism of divine human communion. Thank you.